The story begins in the heart of Manhattan, where glass towers loom over busy streets and boardrooms pulse with the energy of power and ambition. In one of those towers resided Beacon Tech, a mid-sized but fast-growing software company specializing in financial cybersecurity solutions. Beacon Tech had built its reputation on trust, a foundation that, as the world would soon discover, could be shattered in mere seconds. The man at the center of it all was Mark Ellison, a senior IT administrator with a quiet demeanor but a sharp intellect. Mark had been with Beacon Tech for over 7 years, watching it grow from a small team of dreamers into a company valued at hundreds of millions. He was the kind of employee that blended into the background, reliable but unremarkable, a man you'd hardly notice at office gatherings or in meetings. He wasn't flashy, and he didn't crave attention. But that was part of his genius. Mark's boss, Gerald Stanton, on the other hand, was the kind of leader who thrived on being noticed. As the CEO of Beacon Tech, Stanton was a charismatic and ruthless businessman who believed in cutting corners to keep profits high. Employees who weren't deemed indispensable were let go without a second thought. To Stanton, the bottom line always came first. In January of last year, Beacon Tech experienced a rough quarter. Investors were pressuring Stanton to reduce overhead costs. A decision was made to downsize the IT department, which Stanton believed was bloated and overfunded. Despite his years of loyalty and expertise, Mark Ellison found himself on the chopping block. It wasn't just the termination that stung, it was how it was done. On a Friday afternoon, Stanton summoned Mark to his office, accompanied by an HR representative. He didn't even try to sugarcoat it. Stanton told Mark, "We've decided to go in a new direction," while barely looking up from his phone. By Monday, Mark's access to company systems had been revoked, and he was escorted out of the building. Mark's colleagues were shocked. He was the one who had built and maintained Beacon Tech's internal systems, the digital scaffolding that held the company together. But Stanton was unfazed. "Everyone's replaceable," he told his COO with a dismissive shrug. What no one realized was that Mark Ellison had seen this coming. Months earlier, he had begun noticing subtle shifts in company policies and Stanton's growing impatience with senior employees. Mark had anticipated his dismissal, and while he didn't have proof, he suspected his boss was manipulating the financials to appease investors. Feeling both betrayed and wronged, Mark started laying the groundwork for what would later become one of the most daring financial heists in corporate history. In the weeks following his termination, Mark kept a low profile. He rented a modest apartment in Queens and avoided contact with former colleagues. To the outside world, it seemed like he had quietly moved on. But behind closed doors, Mark was working tirelessly on a plan that was as audacious as it was intricate. He began by exploiting a weakness in Beacon Tech's own system, one he had deliberately left unpatched months earlier. As the company's IT administrator, Mark had unparalleled access to the firm's internal networks. He had designed a backdoor that was virtually undetectable, hidden deep within layers of code that no one but him would ever think to examine. Beacon Tech's cybersecurity platform was known for its robust defenses against external threats, but like many companies, it underestimated the danger of an insider attack. Mark's backdoor allowed him to monitor the company's financial transactions in real time, even after his credentials had been revoked. Mark didn't just want revenge, he wanted justice on his terms. He began gathering evidence of financial irregularities, large sums of money being moved to offshore accounts, suspicious expense reports, and discrepancies in investor filings. The deeper he dug, the more damning the evidence became. Stanton wasn't just ruthless, he was also corrupt. But Mark knew that simply exposing Stanton wouldn't be enough. Stanton had powerful lawyers and an army of PR specialists who could spin any narrative in his favor. If Mark wanted to bring him down, he needed to hit him where it hurt most, his wallet. Mark's plan began to take shape. It would involve siphoning funds from Beacon Tech without triggering any alarms, a feat that required both technical brilliance and meticulous attention to detail. He identified a dormant corporate account that had been overlooked in the company's internal audits. The account, originally set up for a now-defunct project, still had access to Beacon Tech's primary financial network. Using his backdoor, Mark reactivated the account and linked it to a series of shell companies he had set up months earlier. Each shell company had a plausible cover: an IT consulting firm, a software vendor, and even a charity specializing in cybersecurity education. Mark had created false identities, complete with fake passports and digital footprints, to give these companies an air of legitimacy. The final step was timing. Mark knew that Beacon Tech's annual shareholder meeting was approaching, a period when the company's financial systems would be under scrutiny. Any discrepancies would be more likely to go unnoticed amidst the chaos of last-minute audits and reports. Meanwhile, Gerald Stanton remained oblivious to the storm brewing around him. He was focused on preparing for the shareholder meeting, where he planned to unveil an ambitious expansion plan that would position Beacon Tech as a global leader in cybersecurity. Stanton was confident, almost cocky, as he rehearsed his presentation in front of his executive team. But Stanton's hubris would be his downfall. He had underestimated Mark Ellison, the man he had dismissed as just another replaceable cog in the machine. As the shareholder meeting loomed, Mark put his plan into motion. Over the course of several weeks, he initiated a series of small, calculated transactions, transferring money from Beacon Tech's accounts to his shell companies. The amounts were deliberately kept below the threshold that would trigger automatic alerts. To cover his tracks, Mark used advanced obfuscation techniques, routing the transactions through multiple intermediaries and masking their origins. By the time the money reached his shell companies, it appeared to be legitimate payments for services rendered. But Mark didn't stop there. He planted evidence within Beacon Tech's systems to suggest that the missing funds were the result of a sophisticated external cyber attack. He even went as far as creating a fictitious hacking group, complete with a manifesto and a trail of fake IP addresses leading back to Eastern Europe. By the time Beacon Tech's finance department noticed the discrepancies, it was too late. Over $7 million had vanished, seemingly into thin air. Stanton was livid, berating his staff and demanding answers. The company launched an internal investigation, bringing in forensic analysts and cybersecurity experts to trace the source of the breach. But every lead pointed to the same conclusion: Beacon Tech had been hacked by an external actor. Stanton was forced to report the breach to investors, framing it as a targeted attack by a sophisticated criminal organization. The announcement caused Beacon Tech's stock to plummet, erasing millions in shareholder value. What Stanton didn't know was that the real criminal was someone he had once dismissed as inconsequential. Mark Ellison had not only outsmarted his former boss, but also ensured that Stanton would never suspect him. Beacon Tech is in turmoil, Stanton's empire is crumbling, and Mark Ellison is sitting on $7 million, waiting to make his next move. Beacon Tech was in chaos. The $7 million breach, paired with the media frenzy surrounding the cyber attack, had thrown the company into disarray. Analysts dissected every aspect of the supposed hack, and cybersecurity firms lined up to offer their services, each claiming to have the tools to prevent such a catastrophe in the future. For Gerald Stanton, the pressure was unbearable. The board of directors demanded answers, and investors were calling for his resignation. His once soaring confidence had been replaced with paranoia. Stanton's every waking moment was consumed with the thought of reclaiming the stolen funds and restoring his reputation. Mark Ellison, meanwhile, was watching it all unfold with a mix of satisfaction and caution. He wasn't naive enough to think his plan was foolproof. He knew Stanton would stop at nothing to find the culprit, and while Mark had taken every precaution to cover his tracks, he also understood that no system was entirely infallible. One mistake, one loose end, and everything could unravel. The turning point came when Stanton brought in an external investigator, a former FBI agent named Evelyn Cross. Cross had built her reputation on solving high-profile cybercrimes and had a knack for finding patterns others missed. While Stanton was focused on damage control, Cross quietly began her investigation, digging through Beacon Tech's systems and financial records with meticulous precision. From the outset, Cross was skeptical of the official narrative. The supposed hacking group had left behind just enough evidence to look convincing, but to her trained eye, something didn't add up. The IP addresses traced to Eastern Europe seemed too convenient, and the group's manifesto felt almost cliché, as if it had been crafted to fit the stereotypical image of a cybercriminal organization. Cross also noticed something peculiar in Beacontecher's transaction logs. The stolen funds had been siphoned off in small, calculated amounts over several weeks, an approach that didn't match the typical behavior of external hackers, who often aim for quick, large-scale thefts. Her instincts told her that this was an inside job. But who? As Cross delved deeper, Mark stayed one step ahead. He monitored Beacontecher's network using the same backdoor that had enabled the heist, watching as Cross pieced together fragments of his plan. When she flagged suspicious transactions, Mark altered the digital trail to redirect suspicion elsewhere. He even created fake logs that appeared to show an insider, someone other than himself, colluding with the fictitious hackers. Despite Mark's efforts, Cross's suspicions only grew. She began interviewing current and former employees, looking for anyone with the motive, means, and opportunity to pull off such a sophisticated scheme. When Mark's name came up during a routine inquiry with IT staff, it was mentioned almost in passing. If anyone could have done something like this, it would have been Mark, one junior technician said with a nervous laugh. The guy knew our systems better than anyone. Cross didn't laugh. Mark knew his time was running out. He had always planned to lie low for several months before moving the stolen funds into safer assets, real estate, offshore accounts, and cryptocurrency. But Cross's investigation was closing in faster than he'd anticipated. Mark decided to accelerate his exit strategy. He withdrew the money from his shell companies in small increments, routing it through an intricate web of international transfers before finally consolidating it into an account in the Cayman Islands. From there, he converted the funds into Bitcoin, knowing the digital currency would be harder to trace. But as Mark scrambled to tie up loose ends, he made his first mistake. In his haste to move the funds, he overlooked a small but crucial detail. One of his shell companies had been flagged by a routine audit just days before the breach was discovered. The flagged account had been reported to Beacontecher's financial department, but the report had been buried in the chaos of the shareholder meeting. When Cross stumbled upon the flagged account during her investigation, it was the breakthrough she'd been waiting for. The account was linked to a consulting firm that, on paper, looked legitimate. But when Cross dug deeper, she found inconsistencies in its business registration documents. The company's listed address led to an abandoned building in Queens, and its phone number went to a disconnected line. Cross traced the firm's digital records and found that its website had been created just weeks before the breach. The clincher came when she analyzed the metadata of the website files. Buried within the code was a timestamp that led her to a private server, one that had been accessed using credentials belonging to Mark Ellison. By the time Cross presented her findings to Stanton, she was confident she had uncovered the truth. Stanton, however, wasn't ready to accept it. "Mark? The guy we fired months ago," he scoffed. "That's ridiculous. He's not a criminal, he's a nerd." But Cross wasn't swayed. "He's a brilliant nerd, and he had every reason to do this," she said, laying out the evidence. "He knew your systems inside and out. He anticipated his termination and exploited a vulnerability he deliberately left open. He's the one behind this." Stanton was furious, both at Mark and at himself. He had underestimated the quiet, unassuming IT administrator, dismissing him as inconsequential. Now, that same man had brought his company to its knees. Cross urged Stanton to involve law enforcement, but Stanton hesitated. Reporting the crime to the authorities would mean exposing the company's internal weaknesses, which could further damage its reputation and stock price. Instead, Stanton decided to pursue Mark privately, hiring a team of corporate investigators to track him down and recover the stolen funds. Meanwhile, Mark was preparing to disappear. He had already rented a small villa in Costa Rica under an alias and was finalizing plans to leave the country. But as he packed his bags, he noticed something unsettling. His computer logs showed that someone had accessed his back door. Cross had found it. Mark realized the game was up. The back door, once his greatest advantage, was now a liability. He quickly disabled it, but the damage was done. Cross now had direct evidence linking him to the breach. As the second act draws to a close, the tension reaches its peak. Mark Ellison is on the verge of escape, but Evelyn Cross is closing in. Beacon Tech's fate hangs in the balance, and Gerald Stanton is left to grapple with the consequences of his arrogance. The question remains, can Mark outmaneuver Cross one last time, or will his carefully constructed plan collapse under the weight of its own ambition? The dense jungle air hung heavy around Mark Ellison as he sat hunched over a rugged laptop, the glow of its screen illuminating his face. He was camped out in a nondescript motel on the outskirts of Mexico, biding his time before crossing the border. The FBI was closing in faster than he'd expected, but he still had faith in his meticulous planning. Mark was no stranger to adversity. In his mind, this was just another problem to solve. He had already set up several contingency plans in case his primary escape route failed. Yet the growing weight of the situation gnawed at him. Evelyn Cross, the investigator tracking him, was proving to be relentless. "She's too close," Mark muttered under his breath as he typed furiously, encrypting files and scrubbing his digital tracks. Every second counted now. While Mark worked to erase his trail, Evelyn Cross and the FBI Cybercrime Division were tightening the noose. Evelyn had analyzed every aspect of Mark's life, from his spending habits to his hobbies, to predict his next move. "He's not going to take a major border crossing," Evelyn told the team during a briefing. "It's too risky. He'll aim for one of the smaller, less guarded routes. And given his background, he'll try to manipulate any digital systems he encounters to his advantage." The FBI set up surveillance at key crossings and checkpoints. Drones equipped with thermal imaging patrolled the border, scanning for signs of human activity in areas too remote for ground agents. It wasn't just about catching Mark, it was about outsmarting him at every turn. Mark knew he was running out of time. His plan to reach Costa Rica hinged on slipping across the border unnoticed. From there, he'd disappear into the country's remote countryside, far from the reach of US authorities. But there was a problem. While his Cayman Islands account still held the bulk of the stolen $7 million, he couldn't access it without drawing attention. The funds were safe, but useless for now. All he had were the emergency cash reserves he'd stashed in various locations, a few $1,000s, barely enough to sustain him for long. Adding to his anxiety, Mark noticed something alarming: his laptop was running slower than usual. He checked his systems and realized his encrypted backdoor, which he'd been using to monitor Beacon Tech, was being probed. Someone, Evelyn Cross, no doubt, was closing in on his last digital refuge. Frustrated, Mark slammed the laptop shut. He knew he couldn't use it again without risking exposure. From this point forward, he was on his own, relying solely on his wits and the tools he'd prepared in advance. Back in the FBI's command center, Evelyn Cross stared at a heat map of recent transactions flagged for suspicious activity. One of Mark's shell companies had recently attempted a small withdrawal, just enough to sustain someone on the move. "That's him," Evelyn said, pointing to the screen. "He's trying to keep his movements low profile, but he's still relying on the network of accounts he created. He's near the Mexican border." The transaction had originated from a gas station just outside the small town of Matamoros. The team sprang into action, deploying agents to the area while Evelyn coordinated from the command center. Mark's instincts told him he was being followed. As he approached the border, the faint sound of helicopter blades grew louder. He abandoned his car on a dirt road and plunged into the dense forest, hoping to lose any pursuers in the thick undergrowth. But the FBI had anticipated this move. Drones with thermal cameras tracked Mark's heat signature as he ran. Evelyn monitored the drone feed in real time, guiding agents on the ground to intercept him. "He's moving west," Evelyn said into her headset. "Cut him off before he reaches the ravine." Mark's lungs burned as he pushed himself to keep going. He could hear the agents closing in, their voices, and the sound of crunching leaves growing louder. He reached the edge of a steep ravine and paused, his chest heaving. Below him, a narrow stream carved its way through the forest. With no other option, Mark slid down the ravine, using tree roots to slow his descent. He landed hard but kept moving, wading through the stream to mask his heat signature. For a moment, it seemed like he might escape. But Evelyn wasn't fooled. He's in the water, she said, analyzing the drone feed. "He thinks it'll hide him." Agents converge on the stream. Mark emerged from the stream, soaked and shivering, and scrambled up the opposite bank. He could see the faint glow of lights in the distance, a small border checkpoint. Freedom was within reach. But as he moved closer, the sound of footsteps stopped him in his tracks. He turned to see FBI agents emerging from the trees, their weapons drawn. A spotlight from a helicopter illuminated the scene, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Mark Ellison, one of the agents, called out, "You're surrounded. Drop to your knees and put your hands on your head." Mark hesitated, his mind racing. He considered running, but he knew it was pointless. With a resigned sigh, he raised his hands and dropped to his knees. The agents moved in swiftly, securing him in handcuffs. The news of Mark's capture made headlines across the country. Fired IT specialist behind $7 million heist caught at Mexican border, one article read. Beacon Tech's investors were relieved to hear that the stolen funds were being recovered, but the scandal had already done significant damage to the company's reputation. Evelyn Cross was hailed as a hero. Her methodical investigation and ability to predict Mark's moves had been instrumental in bringing him to justice. She was offered a lucrative position with a private cybersecurity firm, but declined, choosing to continue her work as an independent investigator. Mark, meanwhile, faced a litany of charges, including embezzlement, wire fraud, and cyber crimes. At his trial, prosecutors painted him as a brilliant but reckless individual who had allowed his grievances to cloud his judgment. Mark's defense argued that his actions were a form of retaliation against an unjust system, but the jury was unsympathetic. He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole. In the wake of the scandal, Beacon Tech underwent a complete overhaul of its cybersecurity infrastructure. Ironically, the vulnerabilities Mark had exploited became the foundation for a new, more secure system. The company also implemented stricter policies for handling terminations, ensuring that no former employee could exploit insider knowledge again. Gerald Stanton resigned as CEO, taking responsibility for the breach and its fallout. His departure marked the end of an era for Beacon Tech, but also the beginning of a slow recovery. Mark Ellison's story became a cautionary tale in the tech world, a reminder of the fine line between genius and hubris. In interviews, Evelyn Cross often reflected on the case. "Mark was brilliant," she said in one appearance. But he underestimated the consequences of his actions. In the end, he wasn't as invisible as he thought. As Mark sat in his prison cell, the weight of his choices pressed heavily on him. The $7 million he had stolen remained mostly untouched, locked away in accounts he could no longer access. All he had left were memories of the life he'd once envisioned, a life of freedom that had slipped through his fingers. For Evelyn Cross and the FBI, the case was a triumph of persistence and ingenuity. For Mark Ellison, it was the ultimate lesson in how even the smartest plans can unravel when confronted by someone equally determined to see justice served. And for the world watching, it was a chilling reminder, no matter how secure you think your systems are, there's always someone out there who knows how to break them, and someone else who knows how to find them.